Our guest today is none other than attorney Yasmin Cader, who is the Deputy Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, also known as the ACLU. How are you today, Attorney Cader?
I am well. I am fired up. I'm excited to have this conversation and grateful for having you invite me here.
Thank you, thank you. And as I said in our offline conversation, that particularly privileged and honored to have you here, just because the ACLU is such a consequential organization that does so much that impacts all of our lives every day. So thank you in advance for all that you're going to share. In this last year, with everything happening in the nation, on the Legal Lens Show, we've really been focused on what's happening nationally and its impact both in our states and locally, and making sure that as things unfold in the nation's capital and in the White House, that we are bringing that to our listeners in a way that helps them to understand what's happening behind the scenes, behind the news bites that we may hear in the everyday and the standard media. And so we definitely want to focus in on that today and what the ACLU is doing in particular. But on our show, we like to go behind the scenes a little bit with our guests because we have the luxury of a full hour show to understand what motivates you, makes you who you are. And so I know you're with the ACLU currently as the Deputy Legal Director. Previously, you were a federal public defender and also in private practice. You're regularly in the news and commenting on key legal issues and developments, and a graduate of Howard undergrad and Yale Law School. What a distinguished background. But let's go behind the lens a little bit. What makes you who you are and motivates you to do the work you do today?
Well, thank you for that question. And I always have to start really where I was raised at Howard University. And it is impossible for someone who's interested in studying political science to go to Howard University and not feel really called on to walk in the footsteps of some of the most important protectors of democracy that ever walked the earth of this country. So I took classes at Frederick Douglass Hall, and I was taught by esteemed political scientists who were really looking at the world and in this country through a very important lens of one of equality, which is such a core fundamental function of democracy. I also studied in the Founders Library in the very room where Thurgood Marshall and
Wow.
Charles Hamilton Houston and others, where they created the road to Brown. So you can't be raised at Howard and not feel compelled and called to want to make this world a better place for everyone.
Yes, indeed. Wow. As you were sharing those insights, just chills going up my spine to have walked in the very same places that some of those folks have walked in. And I mean, just every day now we see Howard has produced such great lawyers and leaders in our country. The list is plenty, right, of the great people that come out of Howard, including our very own Vice President Kamala Harris, former Vice President.
That's right. And I have to just say, as an aside, I have a son who is a freshman and is on the basketball team. So it is really quite a moment in our household because my husband went to Hampton. So you can just imagine.
Right.
We have a lot of very friendly HBCU, real HU competition, but we all know where the Mecca is. So
Yes, yes. Well, go Bisons, right?
that's right. That's right.
All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you, Attorney Cader, for sharing that insight and helping us to understand your why and what motivates you in terms of your professional life and work. So, Attorney Cader, I know for most people, when we say ACLU, we assume they know what the organization is and what it does. But just let's not take anything for granted. Why don't you remind our listeners of the significance of the ACLU and the work that you all do?
Absolutely. So the ACLU is a fundamental, important American institution that's been around for over 100 years. It was formed in the 1920s during a time when we had many attacks on our democracy, when we were facing a real kind of constriction of rights, and it has been going ever since. Its mission is to expand civil rights and liberties for every single person in this country and we do so through so many different lenses, through racial equity, gender equity, really protection of the fundamental First Amendment rights that everyone holds. We are real advocates for immigrant justice. We are there for our LGBTQ communities. And as we say, we do a full court press, right? And so there isn't a family in this country that isn't positively really touched by the work that we do, and we're proud to do it. We're in the courts. We are making sure that people know their rights and that they are empowered by knowing their rights. And we make sure that we are really working hard to ensure that our lawmakers are upholding our civil rights and civil liberties as well.
Right. And it's a nonprofit legal organization, right? But
that's correct.
But the equivalent in the nonprofit world of a law firm, right? That represents clients and interests around the country.
Exactly. It's the people's representatives. You know, we represent people and organizations and causes across the country and it is a nonprofit. And the thing about the ACLU, we have a national ACLU, but then we also have affiliates in each and every single state. So we're a big and large and broad, important presence when we think about being a part of the ecosystem to ensure that the government is held accountable to our Constitution.
And then the Trone Center for Justice and Equality, that's a part of the ACLU. What is that center exactly?
So that's the center that I run, and it houses at the national level all of our work on criminal legal system change and our work on racial justice. So everything from police abuses to fighting for fair bail practices to combating over-sentencing and mass incarceration to advocating for constitutional prison conditions, combating the death penalty. We work on educational equity. We work on health equity. We're seeking to protect our constitutional important civil rights protections for equality purposes. So we have a broad base of priorities within the center, and that's what the fierce warriors who I work with are working on every single day to ensure that justice is upheld.
Excellent. Now, the ACLU, ever since I've been aware of it, is always on the front lines, has always been busy doing cases of consequences, pursuing matters of consequence. But is there a difference in your agenda and your docket or your case matters now as we sit here in November 2025 compared to before January 2025?
Well, absolutely. In terms of just the attacks on our constitutional democracy, this administration, that we are really on the front line, really combating those attacks. And I think it's important to ground the work that we do in that we are always here to combat any type of government overreach into our constitutional rights and liberties. But we're seeing key attacks right now that we are really there to really hold against. And so if I may just talk a little bit of what the nature of those are, what we're seeing is attacks on our core institutions that serve to be really the bulwark against government overreach and abuse. And so we're seeing attacks on law firms. That was really earlier in this year, but it's continuing on to ban them if they don't bend the knee from trying to even be able to appear in court. There's attacks on our universities, again, for their constitutionally protected right to educate, attacks on nonprofits, and attacks on the press. And so that is really, these institutions are core institutions to combat government overreach, and so they have been at the other end of the government's finger. We also are looking at threats to individuals who are ideologically opposed to the government. So we've seen these unconstitutional attacks on activists to seek to deport immigrants just for their speech and to seek to brutalize those who protest. And we're also seeing these indictments of political opponents, Letitia James, James Comey, John Bolton. And so what that is fighting, that is going after the rights of individuals to speak their minds and to associate freely by threatening their liberty. But what might be really one of the most pernicious strategies of this administration is in an effort to score cheap political points, going after vulnerable communities. going after our immigrants with violent, dehumanizing, and unconstitutional ICE raids, try to roll back the clock on equality, defunding scientific research. I read today about a major, major blow to sickle cell research, to asthma research, to cancer research for vulnerable people. They're seeking to erase history. I know you've seen this with the efforts to stop us from talking about our country's complicated past. They're doing that by going after teachers and school districts and universities that dare to talk about the complexity of American history, trying to take down exhibits from museums, erase Harriet Tubman from our national parks trails, and then, surveilling and harassing Black people and other people of color for walking, for driving, for breathing while Black, and seeking to erase many in our LGBTQ communities. And so what all this sums up to is really, it's an attack on our constitutional democracy, on our individual rights, which is a pillar, on our equality, which is a pillar, and on the rule of law with our functioning systems of checks and balances and separation of powers. That's what is being attempted in this moment.
Yes, no, thank you for that overview and that breakdown so much, right? Did the ACLU anticipate that things would be at this level, that there would be attack on so many of these areas? Like, for example, when you all read Project 2025, did you take it seriously and say, yeah, there are going to be some things really at risk here, despite the candidate, now president, saying, no, Project 2025 doesn't control me or direct me. I don't even know what it is. So is it even more unprecedented than the ACLU anticipated, or did you all really anticipate the level of engagement you would have to have at this time?
I can say that we were ready. We really hoped it wasn't going to be like this, but we were ready.
You all borrowed the saying, when people show you who they are, believe them.
That's right. That's right. And we didn't. So for example, we filed the first lawsuit that went after one of the first EOs to try to take away birthright citizenship. We filed that within 2 hours of that executive order. So we were ready. But being ready didn't just mean what we planned. It also meant being able to pivot to what might not have been broadcast. For example, there was a lot of talk about going after immigrants who were in prison or who had committed crimes. He didn't forecast that he was going to do these mass raids on people in the midst of their attending immigration court to try to achieve status. But we were there and we were ready and we pivoted. And so I am really proud of what we've done. I'm proud of what we as an organization has done, but I'm also proud of how we have linked arms with many across different movement spaces to be there. I'm very proud of my colleagues throughout the civil rights community, throughout the immigrant rights community, and the way that we have divided and conquered and really, I think, met the moment. But there's more to meet. There's more to meet. It's constant and it's formidable.
And so when I thought of ACLU over the years, I always thought the protection, an organization that's on the front lines of protecting First Amendment rights. It sounds like that's part of the core, but that it's extended beyond that as well.
Yeah, that's correct. But, I do have to say that, that has always been a very fundamental core part of our mission, but we have always been there for other parts of the Constitution as well. In our very early days, we were there really working very, very closely with the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund on all types of combating different types of racial injustice. We were there in terms of really early protections in the criminal legal space, so due process protections and Fourth Amendment protections. We are core and fundamentally always committed to the protections of the First Amendment, but more broadly to the rights and the individual liberties that all of us possess throughout the Constitution. So we're also here to combat systems of inequity and to fight for equity and equality and justice and fairness. So the First Amendment is a core and fundamental part of that because that applies to everyone, and we all need to have those rights protected. But in order for those rights to assemble and the rights to be expressed, we have to have justice in these other realms as well, and we're committed to it.
Excellent. And so you mentioned being kind of first to file some of the early litigation coming out of this year in this current presidential administration. That was related to birthright citizenship. What's the status of birthright citizenship in the country at this time?
Well, right now in this country at this time, we have been successful. And it isn't just us. I want to be really clear. We're really linking arms with other organizations as well. But it is still very, very robustly and firmly a right. It is something that will be up before the court. But we are urging the justices to follow the law and to follow the Constitution. And we are confident that we will prevail in that. But there's more, when we talk about other constitutional rights and other attacks on them, they're coming from a lot of different angles, and we've been there to combat them in those other angles too. For example, we've been there to really work diligently in the courts to protect the rights of students to learn. And so one of the executive orders was really attacking that on many, many different levels, but including on public schools and secondary and elementary schools' ability to just teach basic concepts of history. And we were able to prevail in one of the cases that was filed, and there were several filed. Again, we're linking arms with our sister organizations, but we're being able to stop that threat at this time. And people are able to, again, feel free to teach as they should, because that pernicious executive order seeking to erase history is something that we've been able to stave off. There's been book bans, right? Including book bans.
And was that a case like that? You don't immediately, obviously, I know as a lawyer, we can't immediately go to the Supreme Court. You usually have to start at a state level court, right?
Or even state in a lower federal
or lower court, federal court. So do you recall where that case was initiated? Like where?
Yeah, that case was initiated in the courthouse in New Hampshire. And again, it's one of several lawsuits that have been filed on this issue. But I don't know that, I think we're going to prevail. I'm very confident that we're going to prevail in that matter and in others as well.
Okay. And how do you all decide what state or lower court to initiate in?
Oh, there's so many different factors. It's really driven a lot like, where are our clients? Where are there community activists on the ground that are seeking to have us come in? Where do we think we are going to have build upon an important precedent in terms of the law? What's the state of our affiliates' interest and engagement? So it's a lot of different factors that weigh into where we decide to file initially.
Attorney Cader, you've given us a great overview, reminding us of the ACLU, its significance, its work for the last 100+ years, and some of the key initiatives that you all have been focused on. We had to cut it short, but I wanted to hear about the litigation you all have been doing around book bans. And that ties to this overall topic of making sure students have a right to learn and right to learn in full, right, about American history and issues that impact Americans. So tell us about that litigation.
Absolutely. Early on in this administration, there was really pernicious and unconstitutional book ban that was issued for students who are in Department of Defense schools. So the children of those who serve in our militaries they're having their reading list censored in the classroom and in the library, with anything pertaining to race and gender that the government somehow found offensive. So on behalf of 6 of those military families who had students enrolled in the Department of Defense schools, we, with our affiliates in Kentucky and Virginia, we filed a motion for a preliminary injunction in May, seeking to declare the enforcement of that executive order unconstitutional. And we were able to prevail, and we are really heartened by this, because what was obvious to everyone was that this was censorship, and it was taking place in such an important learning environment, right, for the children of those who serve this country. And so it was just really important that we stood up for those students' rights, for those families' rights, and that we have gotten this relief in this moment. And so some of the censored items were materials about slavery, about Native American history, about women's history, about LGBTQ identities. There was a full list of 596 censored books. And so I'm really pleased to see that the court agrees with our client and that this injunction has been issued. And so the message is really clear. It's that censorship is unconstitutional.
Yes, yes. And so did the book ban issue extend into just normal public schools as well, K through 12 schools?
So in this lawsuit, this was the one that we were talking about in the Department of Defense, but there have been all types of different actions across this country, and the ACLU, not just now, and throughout our history, the ACLU
Right.
has been there to really combat this type of censoring and to ensure that families and students have the right to learn and that it's made
Right.
abundantly clear for them.
Yeah. So the case you all worked on definitely sets a great precedent for other cases that may come along or are still being litigated along those lines.
Well, I would agree with that.
Any cases that ACLU currently has pending before the United States Supreme Court?
Well, we have many, but one of the ones that I think is really important and of interest to everyone in this country is one that involves our voting rights. And it's called Louisiana versus Calais. And it's about equal representation for Black voters in Louisiana and the role of race in redistricting. And so this case came on appeal following a divided district court decision that found that Louisiana's map, which included an additional majority Black congressional district to remedy a likely Voting Rights Act violation, was a racial gerrymander. And so Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act it's been such a critical tool in safeguarding the promise that people of color can equally participate in our democracy on all of the same terms as everyone else. And so it was just so important that we were there in this matter to attempt to protect these rights. You know, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act with overwhelming bipartisan support back when that fundamental civil rights protection came to be.
Right.
And they continued to reauthorize it over and over and over again, because what was clear that our leaders have known is that you can't cure discrimination if you pretend it doesn't exist. And so you must combat it. You must be able to protect people's rights to vote. It is fundamental to democracy. And it is something that we've been there and argument has been had in that case. And that is something that is going to be decided.
Right, right. And part of why I asked the question around the Supreme Court was really also to get a sense of how the ACLU is seeing the United States Supreme Court. Many would say it's majority biased and that automatically rules in favor of the current administration. And others, and we know that there are those who, don't fully agree with and rule with the current administration. But is there a reason to have hope for this Supreme Court that as they're taking up issues like voting rights and other issues of significance, that they're going to look at them through a fair judicial lens?
I don't know exactly what the court will do, but what I do know is what history tells us, and that is the power of the people to hold the government accountable for its overreach and to change the narrative in society to help promote what we deem to be constitutional just safeguards. And so we have had different courts at different times in our history. After Reconstruction, we had a court that just defied the Constitution, defied what was clear about the intent of the 14th Amendment, and refused to, for decades, have a real analysis that was consistent with our constitutional protections. But then we had not just a change in court, but we had a change in society because of the movement of the people, right? That put that pressure on, because each and every one of us, even if we're not a lawyer, even if we're not a judge, we are part of a constitutional constituency that gets to hold that little constitution which fits in your pocket, gets to hold it in your pocket and have our voices be heard. So I don't want people to despair. I don't want people to turn away or to somehow give
like
up.
we've lost all our power, right?
No, not at all. It is incumbent on us to, if the court is out of step, not just with societal norms, but what is clear, obvious rights that we can interpret as well, that we are making our voices heard and that we are making our voices known. Because there are so many ways in which we as citizens have, and as members of the society, have power. We cannot lay down.
One of the other areas that you all are focused on is related to the deployment, the president's deployment of the National Guard into some of our nation's cities, claiming that there's high crime in these cities and the cities are yearning for the deployment. And that's not necessarily true, we're learning. So what have you all been doing in that regard?
Well, I mean, we are standing by, again, people who live in these cities to both take account of this hypocrisy and these lies that are being told, and to really call out, both in the courts, but also in any other platform that we can, that what's happening right now is the government is waging a war on U.S. cities in an effort to create an unaccountable national police force. They're manufacturing crises. You mentioned this claim of this is the only way that we can combat crime is to send in the National Guard and these federal law enforcement agencies. Well, we know that's not true, right? And we know that in the irony is that instead of making people feel safe, they're terrorizing communities in this effort to have a power grab. But there's also an excuse of there's protests to the government's abuse of power, and that somehow it's necessary to quell these protests. And what we know is these protests are largely peaceful, employing the strategies of nonviolence that are our nation's history when it comes to protest. So it's really important, I think, that in addition to our efforts to be in lockstep with those who are challenging this, the government officials who are challenging this, that we're in lockstep with people who find themselves being terrorized, and that we are making their voices heard in every venue that we can. And one area and one city that is under so much unconstitutional trolling and action is Memphis. And it just, to me, Memphis is such an important part of this nation's history and legacy of civil rights protection. And to see this happening there is just unfathomable. We have armed military troops and agents attempting to do local policing, which isn't their job. They haven't been authorized, and they are creating significant harm. They've created this Memphis Safety Task Force of local and state and federal agencies, again, claiming to make people safer, but instead people are afraid to even come out of their house. There was a pastor who was pulled over by the National Guard for looking lost, but fortunately she is a former school teacher, and when she was asked to provide her license, she said, "Is this normal? Is this what you're supposed to do?" And they left her alone. They pulled a 72-year-old man who was suffering from cancer out of his apartment in his underwear in front of all of his neighborhood because they said, "Oh, well, do you match this description of this other person?" And then asked him for his identification when he's standing there in his underwear. They took his dignity, and they were completely wrong. I mean, he wasn't anybody close to the person that matched that description. They are harassing people, and it has gotten to the point where people carrying their passports as if they have to carry their freedom papers. You know,
I carry my passport with me everywhere now. I mean, at least when I'm traveling, for sure.
and that is just not how you should have to live.
Yeah.
Nor me, nor anybody else in this country. It's as if we're catapulted back to a time when we have to carry our freedom papers to prove that we are somehow free and not enslaved. That is not the society that we are here to protect, and we need to stand up against that.
Yes. Well, thank you to the ACLU for the work it's doing in that regard. It's hitting all of us and making all of us live in a state of fear if we allow it, right? But standing up and standing together definitely makes a difference. So, Attorney Cader, you shared with me offline that African Americans, Black folks, we've been here before. Part of what we're living through right now is not new. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that when you look at this nation's progress and key chapters in that progress, you look at the struggle that Black people have led often for our own liberation, and what it's resulted in is a liberation and for everyone, and really the protection of democracy. I mean, there's nothing more undemocratic than human bondage and slavery, and what Black people and others, right, who also were abolitionists in that time, what that coalition did together was play the long game over centuries of discipline, of resilience, of sacrifice, and really deep strategy. For example, in that time period, one of the most important actions that ever happened was the general strike, where people who were enslaved stopped the production of cotton at great sacrifice to themselves. But they did so, and they did so in coalition. The women's rights movement for suffragists was led off by Susan B. Anthony, but Susan B. Anthony was also an abolitionist. So what we learned from that time period is that together we can really entrench these fundamental concepts of democracy. Same happened when look at the passage of the 14th Amendment. That helped everybody. But who really led that effort to make sure that it happened? It happened because of those who were recently emancipated. And then when you look at the civil rights movement and the war against Jim Crow, again, another long game. Decades of resistance didn't happen overnight, but we stayed the course. And we did so in a multi-racial coalition. And the progress from the civil rights movement was for everyone, because it opened the door to the concepts of gender equality, to immigrant rights. It really entrenched progress for the entire country and entrenched the principles of democracy. So if we take those lessons now to this struggle here, I am confident that we can really find the opportunity in the crisis that we're facing to build back stronger and better with the lessons that we learned from the past.
Wow, what a great history lesson there, and reminder of what we are made of as African Americans, as Americans, and the power of when we come together across racial lines, across gender lines, to all really put forward that American American experience in spirit, which makes us the country that we are. So thank you, Attorney Cader. How do we follow the work of the ACLU and get involved if we want to?
Well, one of the things that I'm really proud of that we are doing is we are working with every one of our affiliates and across this country to ensure that everyone knows their rights. So please go to aclu.org, put in Know Your Rights, get involved in your affiliate in your state, and make sure that you are carrying your pocket constitution in your pocket, and that you are joining forces with us as we continue to march forward to entrench these values of our constitutional democracy.
I'm definitely going to download that myself, and I'm an attorney, but I feel like I need to be empowered and equipped as well. So thank you. Thank you again, Attorney Cader. Thank you to the ACLU for all that you're doing. We hope this is not your last time on the Legal Lens Show. Definitely look forward to having your return.